The summer of 1944, Auschwitz Birkenau, inside a satellite armaments plant called the Weichsel Union Metallwerke, on a factory floor where every laborer assigned to the gunpowder section is a Jewish woman prisoner. A 19-year-old is doing something that will kill her if a guard's hand brushes the wrong part of her body during the evening search. She is rubbing loose black powder into the seams of her own clothing, a few grains at a time, because a teaspoon a day is the most a person can carry without a scale detecting the difference and without her own skin starting to smell wrong. She does this every working day for more than 6 months. She is not the only one. Roughly 20 women are doing it in a chain that passes the powder from the factory floor to a woman named Roza Robota in the main camp, who passes it on again toward a use none of them will live to see finished. To understand what that powder was for, it helps to understand what Auschwitz Birkenau actually was by 1944. The Birkenau camp, formerly Auschwitz II, had been completed in March 1942, covered roughly 5 square kilometers enclosed by an electrified fence, and was by that point the largest single extermination facility the Nazi regime had built, a site where, at the height of operations, roughly 2,000 people a day were killed in gas chambers and their bodies burned in 4 separate crematoria. The men forced to run that machinery to remove bodies from the gas chambers, extract gold teeth, cut hair, and feed the crematoria ovens were themselves prisoners, overwhelmingly Jewish, organized into a forced labor unit the SS called the Sonderkommando. Because they were direct witnesses to the mechanics of the extermination process, the SS periodically liquidated entire Sonderkommando units and replaced them with fresh prisoners, specifically to erase anyone who could later testify to what they'd seen. Everyone inside the unit understood this. It meant that for a Sonderkommando prisoner, survival was never a real possibility. Only the timing of death was in question, and by the autumn of 1944, with the number of incoming transports falling and roughly 200 Sonderkommando prisoners already murdered by the SS that September alone, the timing was clearly running out. Some of the men inside the Sonderkommando spent their remaining time trying to make sure the world would know what had happened, even if none of them lived to say so out loud. A Polish Jew named Zalman Gradowski, deported to Auschwitz Birkenau from the Grodno ghetto in December 1942, after most of his family was murdered on arrival, kept a running written record. In Yiddish, on paper he managed to obtain and hide, describing selections, transports, and the machinery of the gas chambers in granular, literary detail. He buried his manuscript in the ground near the crematoria deliberately, as what historians now describe essentially as a time capsule, on the assumption that he personally would not survive to retrieve it. He and others' buried writings were discovered after the war, sometimes literally excavated from the ash pits where prisoners' remains had been dumped, and are known collectively today as the Scrolls of Auschwitz. Gradowski was also, separately, one of the organizers of the armed revolt that was taking shape inside the Sonderkommando through 1944, a plan that had already been delayed multiple times over the summer when planned uprisings were called off at the last moment, and that existed in uneasy, incomplete coordination with a wider camp underground network known as Kampfgruppe Auschwitz, led by a Polish political prisoner named Józef Cyrankiewicz, who would go on after the war to become Poland's prime minister. That broader camp resistance had, since April 1944, also drawn in a group of roughly 20 Soviet prisoners of war transferred from Majdanek, some of whom worked directly in the crematoria and joined the conspiracy from inside it. The explosives the Sonderkommando needed for any armed action had to come from somewhere inside the camp system, and the only place they could plausibly come from was the Weichsel Union Metallwerke armaments factory, a satellite plant supplying detonator components for German artillery shells, where the entire gunpowder handling section was staffed by Jewish women prisoners. This is where Roza Robota enters the story directly. Born in 1921 in Siakanów, Poland, Robota had grown up inside Hashomer Hatzair, a labor Zionist youth movement built around ideas of collective responsibility and justice, ideas she carried with her into the camp, where she was assigned to sort through the confiscated belongings of murdered arrivals, a job that put her daily in direct physical contact with the material evidence of exactly what the camp existed to do. When the camp underground approached her to help organize a smuggling channel out of the Union factory, she agreed, And by her own reported words to her co-conspirators, "You'll see, we'll pay the Germans back." She treated it as an extension of the same convictions she'd been raised on. Robota made contact with 3 women working directly in the section of the factory that produced gunpowder. Alla Gertner, 32 years old, from a prosperous family in Benzin, who had been assigned to the factory office. Ester Wajcblum, not yet 20, whose older sister Hannah worked alongside her, and Regina Safirsztajn, not yet 30. These 3 did the actual physical theft, palming small quantities of loose powder during their shifts and smuggling it out past the guards, often concealed in the folded paper of empty matchboxes, at a rate historians estimate at somewhere between 1 and 3 teaspoons a day, small enough that inventory counts wouldn't register the loss and searches wouldn't easily detect it on their bodies. Around this core of 4, roughly 20 additional women took part in the wider chain over more than 6 months, carrying, hiding, or passing along portions of the smuggled powder at some stage between the factory floor and the Sonderkommando in Birkenau, and Yad Vashem's own account of the operation notes plainly that some of those women's names were never recovered by history at all. The gunpowder, once it reached Robota, was passed onward to the Sonderkommando underground, who buried it in containers near the crematoria to await use. Through the summer of 1944, the planned uprising was delayed repeatedly. Coordination with Kampfgruppe Auschwitz kept breaking down, and more than once a planned date was called off at the last moment as conditions shifted. What finally forced the issue was the SS's continued, deliberate thinning of the Sonderkommando ranks. On the 7th of October 1944, a Saturday, German personnel arrived unannounced at Crematoria IV and V around noon and began isolating a group of roughly 300 prisoners for what everyone understood correctly to be another reduction. Without time to coordinate with the Sonderkommando units working at the other 2 crematoria, the prisoners at 4 and 5 fought back immediately, using improvised weapons, axes, hammers, stones, along with a small number of firearms and the smuggled gunpowder itself, which was used in explosive devices that set Crematorium IV ablaze and destroyed it. The Germans initially fell back and called for reinforcements. Prisoners in the other crematoria, seeing the fire and gunfire, either joined the fighting or attempted to break for the fence and escape into the surrounding countryside. None of the escapees made it. Within hours, the SS had hunted down and killed nearly everyone involved, Zalman Gradowski among them, killed in the same revolt he had helped organize and had spent nearly 2 years secretly documenting and writing he would never see published. When the count was finished, 3 SS men were dead, and by most historical accounts, including Yad Vashem's, approximately 452 members of the Sonderkommando had been killed. Crematorium IV was never rebuilt. It remains, in the words used by multiple Holocaust historians, the only armed revolt ever staged from inside the operational machinery of a Nazi extermination camp. The investigation that followed worked backward from the wreckage toward the factory floor with the particular patient cruelty the SS reserved for cases where they suspected an organized network rather than a spontaneous outburst. 3 of the Union plant women were arrested on the 9th of October, and Roza Robota was taken the following day, along with 14 men connected to the Crematoria III and IV Sonderkommando. What followed in Auschwitz's notorious Block 11 is documented across multiple survivor and historian accounts as weeks of sustained, severe torture aimed specifically at extracting the names of everyone else who had touched the smuggling chain, beatings, and, according to some accounts, sexual assault. None of the 4 women gave up a single additional name. Because of that silence, the roughly 20 other women who had passed powder through their hands at some point over 6 months were never arrested and lived, in most cases, to see the war end. On the 5th or 6th of January 1945, historical sources differ by a single day, most likely because the executions were staged as 2 separate ceremonies for 2 separate shifts of prisoners. Roza Robota, Alla Gertner, Ester Wajcblum, and Regina Safirsztajn were hanged in front of the assembled camp. Alla and Roza were executed at night, at a roll call staged specifically to be witnessed by the night shift. Ester and Regina were hanged the following morning, in front of the day shift. the SS forcing every prisoner present to watch both ceremonies as a deliberate warning against sabotage. According to the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum's own institutional record, it was the last execution the Nazis ever carried out at Auschwitz. Witnesses gave differing accounts of the women's final words. Some recalled the Hebrew word nekama, vengeance. Others remembered the phrase chazak v'amatz, be strong and have courage, the words God speaks to Joshua in the book of Joshua after the death of Moses, which happened also to be the formal motto of Hashomer Hatzair, the youth movement Robota had grown up inside. Several witnesses recalled the 4 women singing Hatikva as they died. Less than 2 weeks later, the Germans began evacuating Auschwitz ahead of the advancing Red Army. 3 weeks after the executions, on the 27th of January, 1945, Soviet forces reached the camp and it was liberated, meaning the 4 women were killed roughly 3 weeks before the war that had defined and consumed their entire adult lives finally, for that specific patch of ground, ended. What survives of this story beyond the bare facts of the revolt and the executions is, in its own way, as remarkable as the sabotage itself. Zalman Gradowski's buried manuscripts were recovered from the ground near the ruined crematoria in the months and years after liberation, along with writings from several other Sonderkommando members, and have since been published in multiple languages as part of the collection now known as the Scrolls of Auschwitz, meaning that a man who correctly assumed he would die in the same revolt he helped organize nonetheless succeeded in making sure a first-person account of what he witnessed would outlive him by more than 80 years. A former Sonderkommando prisoner named Philip Mueller, who survived the war, gave extensive testimony about the revolt in the camp's machinery decades later in Claude Lanzmann's 1985 documentary Shoah, and the Israeli historian Gideon Grafe compiled a full oral history of Sonderkommando survivors in his book We Wept Without Tears, drawing directly on interviews with the small number of men who lived through what almost no one assigned to that unit lived through. The Auschwitz Birkenau State Museum has placed a marker at the ruins of Crematorium IV, documenting the revolt, and in October 2014, on its 70th anniversary, camp historians held a formal commemoration at the site, describing again, for a new generation, how SS men arriving at the crematorium that October afternoon were met by prisoners fighting back with hammers and axes and a small quantity of gunpowder that 4 young women had spent half a year stealing 1 pinch at a time. There is no comfortable framing available for this story, and this account isn't going to manufacture one. These weren't uniformed soldiers with institutional protections or investigators operating under War Office authority with the option to go home afterward, or even resistance fighters with access to a forest to disappear into. They were prisoners inside the machinery of their own planned extermination, some of them still teenagers, who spent half a year committing an act that carried automatic, certain execution if discovered, for the benefit of men they mostly never met, and in many cases never would, in service of an uprising that killed almost everyone who fought in it, destroyed 1 crematorium out of 4, and did nothing to slow the camp's operation in the 3 months that followed. Roza Robota was 23 or 24 when she died. Ester Wajcblum was not yet 20. The youngest documented participants in the wider smuggling chain were reportedly around 18. None of them are commemorated with a British honors list or a Hollywood adaptation of their story, advised by the woman herself, the way Vera Atkins's agents were. What they have instead is a buried notebook, a handful of survivor testimonies, a plaque by a ruin, and a chain of roughly 20 women whose names, in several cases, no one ever wrote down. If you think a story doesn't need a survivor at the end of it, or a filmmaker, or an institution behind it to matter, say so in the comments and subscribe, because the record of what these women did with a few grains of stolen powder a day deserves to be as well known as anything that happened in a London office.